All right. And it looks like we've got a pretty good crowd of people so far. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this exciting webinar. Before we begin, I want to say that many, if not all of us, are joining from somewhere within the Ottawa River watershed, which is, of course, the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Even when we're meeting digitally as we are today, it's important to remember and acknowledge that fact. J'aimerais aussi vous faire savoir que le webinaire aujourd'hui se déroulera principalement en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions en français ou vous désirez des clarifications en français, n'hésitez pas de nous demander. Et bien sûr, tout le contenu de Garde-rivière des Outaouais est disponible dans les deux langues sur notre site web. If you have questions today, please use the Q&A panel function at the bottom of your screens. We'll take a look at them as they come in, and then I'll ask them to the panelists at the end of the webinar, so you'll have a chance to have all your questions answered. Okay, so if you haven't heard of us before, Ottawa Riverkeeper is a nonprofit and a charity that works to protect the Ottawa River watershed. And earlier this year, we released a comprehensive watershed report card. This was a deep dive into the health of our river system based on 14 indicators of watershed health. Some of these indicators revealed concerning trends, some unexpected results, and we'll be speaking to many of these topics over the next couple of months. They'll come out in webinars just like this one. So you can keep up with this series and our future events by subscribing to our newsletter or following us on social media. There's various ways to stay up to date with us, and I'll toss some links in the chat for you to follow. Today, we'll be exploring the topic of mercury, and we have special guest expert Alexandre Poulain, Professor of Biology and Vice Dean of Research at UOttawa's Faculty of Science. And we also have Ottawa Riverkeeper's Director of Science and Policy, Larissa Holman, who will be going over Ottawa Riverkeeper's data and analysis on mercury and what it means for our watershed. So, Alexandre and Larissa, over to you.
This is where I have to find the unmute button. Thanks very much, Matthew. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen and giving a quick introduction to the work being done by Ottawa Riverkeeper. And then Alexandre is going to present to everyone about mercury and what exactly it is and why we're interested in it. So this is always where I show how technologically savvy I am, and here we go. So hopefully everyone can see the screen. This is the webinar. As Matthew said, we are meeting on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin peoples, and just want to also mention that Ottawa Riverkeeper recognizes the legacy of colonialism that continues to have a profound impact on the rights of Algonquin people, and that there's great urgent need for meaningful actions that truly confront this legacy. We work throughout the Ottawa River watershed. It is pretty much exactly the territory of the Algonquin people, but for those who are not familiar with how large the Ottawa River watershed, the river itself is over 1,200 kilometers long. It starts in Lac des Outaouais, up in the top eastern part of the watershed, and the mouth of the watershed is down by the Lac des Montagnes. It is a provincial boundary, and so it splits the provinces of Quebec and Ontario for a large part of the river. And this is one of the challenges of working in this watershed, is that it is a multi-jurisdictional space, not only through different levels of government, but also through different provincial governments as well. A little bit more about us. As Matthew mentioned, we are a nonprofit, a charity. We also act as a watchdog for the river. We try to find ways and take actions to protect the river as much as possible. And so sometimes that is following up on pollution hotline calls, and sometimes it's about training citizen scientists to go out there and collect data and be able to be informed about what's happening in their section of the watershed. As mentioned, we work across jurisdictions. We are also part of a global Waterkeeper Alliance, and one of the most important parts of our work is that we remain independent, non-government, and non-partisan. And so it's our independent voice is very important. So as we find findings and analysis, such as what was happening with the Watershed Report Card, we're able to share those in a way that is unhindered. And we really try to make decisions based on science-based, evidence-based data. So here's a picture of the Watershed Report Card. It was a big effort that we did over many years. And as Matthew mentioned, it is how this Mercury data was pulled together and where it is shared. Our website has a full report, but I'm sure Matthew will share the link in the chat as well. The report card came out of an assessment that we did over the last number of years. In 2019, we completed a report called Assessing the Health of the Ottawa River Watershed. And from there, 14 indicators were identified to try and measure watershed health. We used a variety of different data sources to fill data gaps. We used engaged community-based monitoring programs. And it's been a really interesting effort over the last number of years, pulling this data together and trying to make a better understanding of what might be happening in this watershed. Today, we're here to talk about the indicator Mercury. And it is such a great pleasure that we have Alexandre Poulain here with us to talk about that. So I'm going to hand it over to Alexandre so he can provide an introduction to Mercury, but also just why it's important to understand what's happening with Mercury in local watersheds. So Alexandre, over to you.
Thanks, Larissa. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous et à tous. I will be setting up the presentation. Okay. All good? So Larissa and Matt have asked that I provide to you guys this morning a bit of an overview of the science behind how mercury cycles in the environment. And mercury is probably one of the most exciting, from a scientific perspective, metal to study because it never does what we expect. So in terms of research, this is very stimulating. I'm a professor in the biology department. I am a microbiologist. Which is important when we study mercury because the neurotoxin methylmercury is being produced by microbes. And I've been studying mercury for 25 years. I've started as a young undergrad student and I've never stopped. So I will tell you a bit of the story of mercury in freshwaters. And I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have at the end of the presentation. So when we talk about mercury, we often refer to different chemical compounds. And so the same way biologists like to name animals and plants by different species, chemists also call different compounds of the same element different chemical species of mercury. And so mercury is really unique in the way that, as you probably know, this is the only metal that is liquid at room temperatures. And mercury really, really likes to bind to other compounds in its immediate environment. So you can make the analogy that mercury is a very promiscuous metal, and it's quite discriminating what it likes to bind to. Mercury really likes to bind to sulfur. And why is this important? Because sulfur is an essential component of proteins. And we are alive because of the structural and activity of proteins that are essential to the proper functioning of our cells. And so if mercury interacts with our protein, then there is huge consequences on the functioning of the cells and therefore on our health. And so this is the basis of its toxicity, this ability that it has to stick to protein. And this is why mercury tends to accumulate in muscles and not in fat, because it really likes those proteins that are part of the muscle that we consume, for example, when we consume fish. There is different species of mercury, as I just mentioned, some inorganic mercury species here, mercury 2+, mercury 1+, and elemental mercury, which you are probably all aware of because this is the mercury species that probably for the oldest of us played with when we were kids, when we broke a thermometer. And unfortunately, mercury also exists as organic mercury species, which are the compound of mercury that are the most dangerous. And why are those elements so dangerous? Because they have this little mercury, a methyl group that is bound to the metal. And this little methyl group is the key for the mercury to our brain. Our brain is protected by a fat layer, and this little methyl moieties allows the mercury to cross the brain-blood barrier and access our brain, and therefore exerts this neurotoxicity. We've used mercury for millennia. It has been used in traditional Chinese medicine as a remedy. It's used in industrial activities. You're probably aware of the fact that because mercury likes to bind to protein and sulfur, it's used to soften pelts. And if it's used to soften pelts, hat makers tend to use it. And this is why often we refer to hat makers as the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland, because of the exposure to mercury. We became aware at a global scale of the toxic nature of mercury following up the accidental release of organic forms of mercury in Minamata, Japan in the mid-50s to early 60s. And this was a catastrophic accidental release of organic mercury compound as a byproduct of acetaldehyde production. So it was a chemical production company that used mercury as a catalyst and released its effluent in the bay. And we quickly discovered that the mercury that was released by the company accumulated in the food web, and with horrific consequences on wildlife and people consuming the food provided by the sea and the ocean in this location. And so this is really in the mid-50s that we became aware of the link that exists between the toxin in the water and the toxin level in the food. So we've known for a while that mercury affects all our systems, primarily our brain, because of this ability to cross the protective layer that we call the brain-blood barrier. But also it affects our respiratory system, our circulatory system, and of course it's detrimental to the developing embryo and fetus. So mercury is interesting and quite unique because this is the only metal that will bioamplify in food webs. And this is why I wanted to make this distinction between the different species of mercury that exist. Methylmercury is bioamplified in food web, but not the inorganic form of mercury. So in ecotoxicology, we distinguished bioaccumulation, which you have here on the top of the picture, which is the increase in concentration inside a cell or inside an animal body. So the older the animal or the older the organism, the more mercury will accumulate, because the speed at which it enters is greater than the speed at which it's being eliminated. But for methylmercury, not only does it bioaccumulate over time, but it's also amplified in food webs. And that means that at every step in the food web, concentration of methylmercury increase, and you can have differences of millions between the concentration in water and the concentration in fish. So you can safely, typically, as far as mercury is concerned, drink the water, but you can't consume the animals or the fish in that system. So what processes remobilize mercury in the environment? Typically, it's artisanal and small-scale gold mining and coal combustion. Pretty much any combustion process which releases mercury in the environment. How do we know this? Well, we have what we call environmental archives. And so you have a representation of such environmental archive here, which is here a sediment core. So we go and collect those long layers of sediments. And because sediments record time, you know, the deeper layers have been deposited in more ancient time than the top layers. And so we can reconstruct the history of how much mercury has been remobilized in the environment. So for example, you can see those green peaks here that corresponds to volcanic eruptions, because volcanoes contribute to take the mercury that exists in the crust and put it back in recirculation in the atmosphere. Don't forget that mercury is a naturally occurring element, part of the periodic table. Humans do not create mercury. We only contribute to remobilize it. Interestingly, you can see here in orange a huge impact of the gold rush. Why? Because mercury and gold form a very strong amalgam. And so during the gold rush, mercury was used to collect the gold from the environment, and still is in many parts of the world, which is a huge problem. And of course, at the onset of the Industrial Revolution, Coal combustion, as you can see in red, has led to more mercury being remobilized. We are all responsible. All countries are responsible for the production of mercury in the world, or the release of mercury in the world, excuse me. So this map shows the emission of mercury. And I know the map dates from 2010, but it's still pretty accurate. So the warmer the color, the redder the color, the more mercury is being emitted. In the northern hemisphere, it's mostly due to coal-fired power plants. In the southern hemisphere, it's mostly associated, in this case here, to artisanal gold mining. Mercury is a global pollutant, meaning that from a single point source, it will travel in the atmosphere throughout the globe. So let's assume we have a coal-fired power plant in Canada or in Northeast United States. That single mercury atom will travel all over the world and will stay in the atmosphere between 6 months to over a year before it finally gets deposited onto terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem, where it's becoming a problem for us. So for example, emissions here in the Northeast of the United States and Canada travels to Europe, and we are affected, of course, because of the movement of air masses by mercury produced in Asia. So the mercury that travels in the atmosphere is this elemental mercury. It's not the mercury that accumulates in our fish. So therefore, we need to find the link between the mercury that is in the atmosphere and the mercury that is in the fish. And microbes here are the main catalyst to producing this organic mercury. Remember, the organic mercury is the only one that is bioamplified in food webs. So scientists must find first what is the source of this organic mercury. So of course, there is direct industrial sources, as I mentioned, because of chemical synthesis, or because historically, not anymore, mercury was used as a pesticide, but they're quite rare. However, the prevalent source of methylmercury in the environment is because of the activity of microorganisms that take this inorganic mercury that comes from the atmosphere and produce the neurotoxin. And we became aware of this process in the late 60s with the work that I mentioned here, published in Nature by two Swedish scientists. So how do microbes, under which condition do microbes produce this neurotoxin is of paramount importance to understand its fate. So I'm going to give you a bit of a refresher on biochemistry here, and I'm using my twin boys in their bath as a reminder that humans, are typically animals, consume glucose and burn off and use oxygen. So they burn the glucose by respiring oxygen, they produce CO2 and water, and that's how most animals produce energy. Microbes, on the other hand, have been around for a very long time. Microbes have been around on planet Earth before oxygen was even available. Oxygen, for a reminder, appeared on planet Earth around 2 billion years ago, but microbes have been around for almost 4 billion years. So there is a huge diversity of microbial life that absolutely does not require oxygen, and they do quite well without oxygen. And so in this case, the microbes that produce methylmercury respire sulfate and not oxygen. It's absolutely incredible, the diversity of metabolism types that microbes can have. And how do we know this? Because when microbes respire sulfate, they produce hydrogen sulfide. And you've all been in contact or affected, or you probably know of hydrogen sulfide because it smells like rotten egg. Hydrogen sulfide is that's what sewer smells like if you walk on the beach. Sometimes your toes sink in the sand, and there is this black sand or mud that comes out that smells like rotten egg. This is the activity of those microbes in the environment. It's a completely natural process. Unfortunately, accidentally, they also produce this potent neurotoxin. So the reason why I'm mentioning this to you is because it's much more complicated than, well, we just need to stop how much mercury gets into the system. No, because the microbes can actually take tiny amounts of mercury and make the neurotoxin. So what is important is that we identify the condition that makes the microbes produce this toxin. And because in general, the postulate or the idea is that the total concentration of mercury alone is a very poor predictor of its fate. You can have a large amount of mercury in a system, But if it's immobilized, it's not in contact or accessible or bioavailable to microbes, nothing much is going to happen. However, you can have tiny amounts in ideal productive conditions in the absence of oxygen, and a lot of the neurotoxin will be produced. And because of ecological amplification through food web, human and wildlife will be exposed to it. So this is really this link that we'll try to explore with Larissa, the importance to identify those methylmercury hotspots in the environment that couple the long-range atmospheric transport of mercury, that is emitted as elemental mercury. It can recycle many times around before reaching down into the dark part of a lake where it's anoxic and where the methylmercury is being produced. The same idea can be applied to river systems, of course. So one example of those systems that has been very well studied that contribute to the production of methylmercury are the installation of hydroelectric dams, because building a dam does not bring more mercury in the environment. It favors the formation of the most toxic form of mercury, methylmercury. How so? By flooding terrestrial system. By flooding terrestrial system, you flood the plants, the animals, the ground that contains organic matter and mercury, and you create ideal conditions to produce the neurotoxin. And when we look at mercury level in fish in those dams, you can see that there is an increase in methylmercury concentration, represented on the y-axis here, over time. So in the gray area, this is the guidelines typically that we want to see. And you can see that there is a large increase over several years, and then it takes decades for the level to go down. This is this memory of the system, this latency that exists in the system to finally, for the fish level of mercury to decrease. Humans are responsible for making dams in the environment, but often our environment is affected by other types of ecosystem engineers, such as beavers. And so when beavers contribute to flood ecosystem, the same story happens. Terrestrial ecosystem are being flooded, the organic matter concentration increases, the microbes that thrive in the absence of oxygen are very happy, and the methylmercury is being produced. So I'm going to leave you with this slide here before Larissa presents some of the elements of the report. Trying to understand what's happening and manage mercury pollution needs to be studied at multiple scales. It's important to understand at the microbial scales what stimulates the production of the neurotoxin, but it's also really important to understand how food webs are being structured, because this is what wildlife and humans are exposed to. So it's important to identify the role of changes in water chemistry, and you're probably all aware of acidification, eutrophication, but also habitat loss. Because when there is a change in aquatic habitat, food web structure will be altered. And if food web structures are altered, the path for methylmercury from the low level to the top level will be affected. So with this, I'm going to leave you with this idea that it's really, really important to understand driver from multiple perspectives. That's it for me, Larissa.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're going to switch slide presentations. And what I'm going to do now is present our findings from the report that went into our Watershed Report Card. In the Watershed Report Card, you will find an overview of the work that we did and the analysis we did. And there is information in there about our findings in mercury. But as part of this project, we're also uploading longer reports that go fully into the analysis and explores all of the different background information that we use to come to these results. And so we're making those available on our open data portal in both English and French. And I'm going to share some of those results with you now. So the first thing to sort of make clear is, where did we get this data and what exactly, how did we come to the conclusion that we did? So the data selected was available from provincial consumption guidelines. Each province takes fish samples and does an analysis on it. And from there, they provide information about what is available or what are the concerns, or if there are any concerns around how much fish you should eat in a certain location. And this data is very much something that is available for specific locations. And so each of these dots represents one of the locations that we were able to get data from. The data was provided from 1970 to 2020, so it's a good long data set. And that the data provided information both by species and by length of fish. So this really helps with the analysis because, as Alexandre mentioned, bioaccumulation is one aspect of all of this. And so smaller fish will not have as much mercury present in their system as will larger fish that have been in that environment for a longer period of time. And lastly, to really try and understand the watershed and where there might be different implications, we divided the watershed into 3 different sections. This was to represent different geologies, but also some different activities that might be happening. And so you can see here, there's a purple, a blue, and a lighter blue section of the watershed. The lighter blue section we called the Lower Ontario's, or the Ontario side. The purple area we called the Lower Quebec side, and then the Upper Watershed. And the reason why it extends so far east on this map is because that is to represent the watershed that flows into Lake Temiskaming and then down the Ottawa River. So we wanted to capture those geologies together. And oops. So just to demonstrate what this looks like, within these different areas, we looked at the land use itself. And so as you can see, this is the case for much of the Ottawa River. It's primarily forested. The Lower Ottawa is the least forested area. It also has the highest percentage of agricultural areas and a fair amount of wetlands. Similarly with the Upper and Lower Ottawa, really heavily forested. The difference in those 2 areas is the percentage of wetlands, with the Upper Ottawa having a higher percentage of wetlands present. I'm just going to step back for a minute and explain a little bit about why this matters. So the thing about the Ottawa River watershed, which makes it unique and awesome in many different ways, is that the geology of it is quite unique. The lower part of the Ottawa on the Ontario side is predominantly agriculture. It's also geologically has a really rich substrate. It's one of the reasons why we see so much agriculture there. There's a lot of nutrients and minerals present within the soil that helps with cultivation. These minerals also help with alkalinity, which means that they're able to buffer acidic solutions. They're able to reduce the acidity when it is introduced into an area. With the other side of the watershed on the Quebec side, there is the Canadian Shield, and this geology does not contain those same minerals, and so there's not the same volume of calcium, for example, which is present in limestone, which helps to neutralize acidic conditions. And this really has a big impact on these findings because, as Alexandre mentioned, acidification is one of the drivers for mercury to transform into methylmercury. So I'm just going to try and fix my screen has gone all funny. There we go. I'm going to now show you some of the results that we found. We took a look at over 40 different fish species. Liam Nugan is our scientist, and he analyzed over 26,000 data points to come up with this analysis. We focused on 4 of the most popular fish species in terms of the records in the consumption guidelines, so the ones that were caught most often, and we had the most data available for them. And so what we have found is, again, breaking them up between small, medium, and large, and looking at these different regions. I hope everyone can see this, but the first group is lake trout, the second group is northern pike, the third group is smallmouth bass, and the fourth group is walleye. And so what you see is over their lifespan as they get from small to large, the amount of mercury increases. This red line is the consumption guideline. So this is once you've passed this consumption guideline, there will be something that is triggered that would reduce the number of times you should eat this type of fish over the course of a month. Again, it is really specific to a location, and those consumption guidelines are available publicly, so people should really refer to those when trying to understand what might be the situation in an area that they might be fishing in directly. But to be honest, when we saw these results, we were quite surprised. We did not expect there to be such high levels of mercury within our watershed, primarily because there's not a lot of industrial activity in parts of this watershed. And so that we don't have a direct source for mercury to be present. So we tried to take another look at this data and try and understand what was happening over time. And this is where we looked at the trend data. So looking only at walleye, you can see that over time, so from the 1970s to 2020, I think is when we stopped, but 2022, and for some of these are the results for the years that data was collected. Again, these are consumption guidelines, and so it really is tricky to know how often data is collected from each of those locations, but overall, for each of these species, based on their length, we looked at them, breaking them into small, medium, and large, and again, by species for the four different species we did this deep analysis on. And we found that over time, the trend for mercury concentrations within fish species was declining. You can see here, this black line shows you the trend over the whole period of time. And then this red one is a more responsive to what's happening within the data from a year-to-year basis. So it does a little bit more fluctuating. One of the curiosities for us is that despite it declining over time, there is this uptick of mercury for many of the species currently. And so we're sort of like, what is changing right now that is impacting it, that allowed mercury levels to go down in the 90s and early 2000s, and now it's going back up again. It might be the fact that this data doesn't have the rest of the trend line to help keep it down, but we wanted to explore it a little bit more closely. And so we looked at emissions, and because how else would mercury get into this watershed? We have the geology that is really allows for mercury to be transformed easily into methyl mercury, but to have these higher levels or this change in amount of mercury available, we wanted to understand what might be going on. So we looked at mercury emissions locally between Ontario and Quebec, and using these as examples of what might be happening in other areas, we noticed a really steep decline in the total mercury emissions in Ontario and Quebec. And so this could very well have an influence on the presence of mercury in the water bodies and the opportunities for it to transition to methyl mercury. We also wanted to understand how our watershed did, or how the Ottawa River watershed did, compared to other locations which are known to have direct inputs like Lake Ontario and Lac St. Pierre. And so we ran the same analysis for the same four species and looked at those trends overall to try and get a sense of what does this mean in comparison to like areas that are known to have higher rates of effluent pollution. And again, it was really surprising to see this difference, that Lake Ontario, which is the second bar here, and Lac St. Pierre, which is the first group, was so much lower than what is present in the Ottawa regions. Again, the lower Ottawa, on the Ontario side, the lower Ottawa on the Quebec side, and then the upper Ottawa. And when comparing these these different areas, over the lifespan, the fish in Lac St. Pierre and Lake Ontario did go up, but once again, fish within the Ottawa River watershed really have higher levels of mercury present in them. And so it goes back to those conditions in the watershed that are just so easily transform mercury into methylmercury. And so my last slide is to take a look at that aspect of the dams that help to create these conditions for mercury to be present. The thing that really struck me about methyl when I was first reading about it and learning about it is this description saying that if you have a watershed that has turbid water with lots of tannins in it and lots of wetlands, you are likely to have a lot of mercury present. And that does describe the Ottawa River watershed quite a bit. We are lucky in so many ways. There are lots of wetlands present, and those are a really critical part of our watershed. But what might have we done over time to maybe tip the scale to make those conditions a little bit more prevalent? And when we look at the dams present in the watershed, it really strikes home. So this is a map that, once again, Liam put together. He's awesome. I can't say enough good things about the work that he does. But what you see here are the larger dams that we speak of most often, which are located along the Ottawa River water itself, and some of the larger tributaries like the Gatineau. The blue areas where we have large reservoirs, and then the red dots show any of the smaller dams. They're not necessarily producing hydroelectric dams, but they were put in place over time to help with water regulation, making water available for the small communities that are in those areas, helping to control some of the flow. But inevitably, they did cause some of the water to flood the areas behind them. And so there's likely an impact from these as well. And so that is basically what we looked at. The other part that I do really want to highlight is this data is publicly available. And yet, because of the divide within our watershed between these two provincial bodies, there hasn't been a deep analysis of what the trends look like for mercury completed by those provinces together. And so this is the first opportunity that we've had to really understand mercury levels within the watershed, across the watershed, by taking the time to do all of this analysis. And so I do have to sort of open up the conversation and the discussion. I have a question or a couple of questions for Alexandre, and that is, looking at the number of dams that are present, comparing the results to areas where we know there is more direct pollution, but that so much of the mercury might be coming from atmospheric mercury. Is there anything that we can do to help sort of, if not reduce, then at least control the amount of mercury present? Or is there anything being done on the global stage right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's two things that can be done. First of all, there is now a convention on mercury, and I can just put you, I'm going to share a bit.
I'll stop sharing.
This is
the fun of enjoying the sharing capacity.
Yeah, so let me just bring this up here. So there is what we call the Minamata Convention on Mercury, and so is a global treaty to protect human health and the environment from the adverse effects of mercury. And so this is an international UN-driven convention where signatory countries or parties have decided to do something to limit the mobility and emission of mercury in their respective area of jurisdiction. So far, what's encouraging at the global planetary stage, because I think we understand now that yes, there is the mercury that is industrially emitted, there is point source of mercury that have dramatic consequences in the environment, such as Minamata, and I believe one of our auditor mentioned grassy narrows during the presentation, those are industrial punctual sources of mercury. The consequences are as dramatic, but we are here talking about the mercury that travels in the atmosphere and that is constantly being rained on us through precipitation and aerosols deposition. So the country signatories of this convention have decided to come together and make into law into their respective countries ways to limit mercury mobility in the environment. So that's step number one. And step number two, it's at the individual and regional level to work on what we know affects water quality, eutrophication, watershed management. We need to talk to our policymakers. We need to talk about watershed authorities that control, for example, the permits to build those dams if it's the main issue in the Ottawa River watershed. So we can act at different levels, of course.
Out of curiosity, for a watershed like the Ottawa River watershed, I'm totally taking advantage of the fact that I'm not on mute to ask another question to Alexandre. And the geology is such that it can't buffer for acidity. The impact of acid rain back in the 80s, how would that have driven mercury levels in this watershed?
This is a really interesting question. We know that at any level, whether it's at the level of producing the neurotoxins, so the microbes, deep in the lake that produce methylmercury, they will take up more mercury under acid conditions. So even if you have a tiny amount of mercury, maybe not 100% of it can be accessed, can go inside the cell. Where when you decrease the pH, when it's more acid, you actually produce more of the methylmercury. And number two, once the methylmercury is being produced, low pH favor its entering into the food webs. So, controlling acid rain has had excellent impact on the health of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem, but an unintended consequence might have been to some extent limit methylmercury movement in biological systems.
Awesome. Matthew, do you want to jump in with a question?
Yeah. So reminder that there's the Q&A panel down at the bottom. If you have a question for Larissa about Ottawa Riverkeeper's results, or Alexandre about mercury in general, or how it's produced, please go ahead and ask them. We have a couple questions coming in. So I'll ask this first one from Paul. I'm going to summarize your question a little bit, Paul. But essentially, Paul's asking, is there an effective way to clean up mercury once it's found in the environment? What can you do? Can you intentionally bioaccumulate it? Is there a way to force it into a less harmful form? What can be done once you have high levels of mercury?
I can try to answer the question.
Please.
Yeah. So in the context of an industrially emitted source of mercury, there is multiple ways to look at this. Either you drag the sediments that are contaminated out of the system. So you literally remove the mercury problem by transporting it into a place where it can be safely sequestered and managed. Number two, you do nothing, and you expect the environment to naturally attenuate the process. And there are examples, especially, I've been giving a bad rep to microbes in this talk, telling you that they produce the methylmercury, which is true, but microbes are very diverse. And we know now, and we've been knowing for a while, that some microbes can actually detoxify the environment. And so this is an area of research that we study in my lab, but we can use, biotechnology to take the mercury that could potentially become methylmercury, or we can take methylmercury and use microbes to degrade it, to degrade the methylmercury and make it less toxic. I believe Paul also mentioned what happened in Grassy Narrow, and this situation had been to keep it in place, but I think that the problem reappeared recently. I think it made the news in June, or in May or June. Why? Because the operator of the plant started to release sulfate. And so, there is no issue with sulfate. The problem is that I just told you that the microbes that produce methylmercury love sulfate. That's what they use to breathe. And so by indirectly mismanaging or misunderstanding the situation. They've made the problem worse because the mercury that was stored in the system, really not accessible, no methyl mercury was being produced. The fact that we introduced sulfate, something really, really not toxic, you know, there's way more sulfate in the ocean than in fresh water, we made the problem worse. So small changes in the water quality can exacerbate the mercury problem. So to go back to your question, either we don't do anything and it's natural attenuation, we hope, or we control biotechnology in situ or ex situ, or we completely remove the sediments that are problematic. But most of the issue that most of us would be exposed to mercury, it's just the mercury coming down from the atmosphere. You know, if you look up, if we were able to tag mercury, it would be everywhere. It's all around us.
I love that answer
Oh.
because it also just really highlights the importance of using an ecosystem approach or like using different factors and not just looking at pollutants one at a time. That can be so restrictive in terms of understanding its impact on the environment overall. Because as you said, sulfate on its own is pretty benign, but when introduced to an environment with lots of mercury, it suddenly changes the conditions quite dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of semi-following up on that question, il y a une question de Isabelle. Y a-t-il des actions individuelles que les citoyens peuvent prendre pour réduire leur impact, ou est-ce que c'est un problème à l'échelle industrielle?
Je pense que chaque citoyen, donc il y a un problème industriel et ça, le problème industriel dans par exemple la combustion de charbon. Le charbon, une fois qu'il est brûlé, va contribuer à émettre du mercure dans l'environnement et donc ce mercure va voyager sur de longues distances pendant de longues périodes de temps et se déposer. J'ai fait mon doctorat dans l'extrême arctique et on se retrouve avec des concentrations de mercure dans l'extrême arctique extrêmement élevées alors qu'il n'y a absolument aucune source de pollution directe de mercure dans ces régions-là. Donc c'est vraiment un problème global. Et la Convention de Minamata contribue à limiter, par exemple, l'utilisation de sources d'énergie polluantes comme le charbon. Au niveau individuel, on peut travailler à s'assurer de la bonne qualité de nos cours d'eau et de nos bassins versants en limitant ou en prenant des actions, par exemple, pour limiter l'eutrophisation ou une augmentation de la concentration en matière organique qui alimenterait ces processus microbiens. Donc oui, le problème doit être traité à différentes échelles, de l'échelle individuelle jusqu'à l'échelle industrielle et globale. Absolument.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alexandre. Larissa, I'm going to shoot this question at you because I think it's from one of our river watchers, Carol. And Carol's asking, when river watchers are doing water monitoring, are pH data points sensitive enough to get an idea of local mercury conditions? And maybe I'll expand that question. Is there any way to sort of identify mercury conditions when doing sort of community-based monitoring?
So my gut response to that is no, but that's not necessarily a bad answer. What pH is telling us is what is the acidity or how basic the water might be. And there are multiple different conditions that need to be present for mercury to transform into methylmercury. And so the Ottawa River itself, because of its quick flow, it might have, if it has a lower pH value, so something that is more acidic is going to be in the lower range of pH, then the possibility of methylmercury being taken up by organisms is higher and the transformation is higher. But the Ottawa River is a quick flowing river, and so the opportunity for eutrophication is not as present. Eutrophication is when you have lots of nutrients present and the oxygen levels start to go down. And so that is not the case in the Ottawa River because it moves so quickly and it's mixing and whatnot. It might be more present in the lakes that are available, or also some of the smaller lake systems. And really where we see the higher levels of mercury are in those areas that are off the main stem of the Ottawa.
Great, fantastic. And Larissa, this might also be a question for you, but Alexandre, jump in as well. It's from Clarissa. What advice would you give to people who fish in the lakes and river in the Ottawa River watershed based on mercury levels and this analysis?
I think it's appropriate for people to be aware of what pollutants might be present if they're fishing in different areas, and that's why those fish consumption guidelines are so important. Again, it is so specific to each location that you do really need to look up what is recommended, and those are recommendations. If those recommendations aren't available, one way to consider what fish might be safer to eat. I'm not going to say that eating a fish a month is going to have the same impact of eating it daily, is to eat smaller fish or to eat fish that are known to be, that are not predators, because with the predators, you have the situation of both bioaccumulation and magnification. I don't know. I see Alexandre nodding his head, so
I think it's great. I think it's great.
Yeah.
You know, I totally echo what you said about following up regional and local guidelines. But yeah, feeding, we know that eating fish is good for you. It's absolutely, you know, it's essential to a healthy, balanced diet. And so as a consumer, we can make the choice to feed on fish that themselves feed at lower trophic levels. So planktivorous fish, you know, I think in the video we give the example of the whitefish, or smaller fish, because they have, as long as they are, you know, I know there is regulation for size of fish we can consume, but that they will have spent less time in the system and therefore usually typically would exhibit less load of contaminants.
And if you're looking for those fish consumption guidelines, I did put them in the chat, so you can click there and you can also just look them up based on the province. Fantastic. Keep the questions coming, folks. I see a question from Ron asking about a hot topic in the watershed, but is there any mercury production tied to the nuclear activity at Chalk River?
That's a great question, and that's one that I would need to follow up on. I can't say offhand that mercury is something that we've looked at the Chalk River site. We've been really focused on the radionuclides that might be coming from that space, or the different industrial contaminants that might be present that would be headed towards something like the near surface disposal facility. There is, of course, effluent that comes from that site, and there's likely energy being produced, but I don't think they use a lot of coal burning facilities at the Chalk River laboratories, but I could also follow up if you wanted to get more information there.
Yeah, if you have any questions after this webinar or you want any further information, please do email us, go on our website, find our contact information, reach out. We're happy to answer questions about the watershed and about this data.
And if you want to do a deep dive yourself, the Chalk River Laboratory, so CNL, does make their environmental reports available. They are very long documents, and you can spend a lot of time reading them. So I can do a quick search of what's available if that would be easier.
And Larissa,
from Howard.
Yeah, do you want to take the question from Howard? Go for it.
Yeah, so it's a similar answer to what was said earlier about the conditions on the Ottawa. One of the reasons why the levels in Lake Ontario or like Lac St. Pierre is likely because they are not, they don't have these are large water bodies and they have a certain amount of flow that happens within them. And so the anoxic conditions, which is also eutrophication, may not be as present in those lakes. And so despite mercury pollution probably being more directly related in those situations, the conditions don't exist for it to transform to methylmercury as readily as we see in the Ottawa River watershed, because we have so many wetlands, so many different dam systems. So that's my guess at that answer. I'm going to turn it over to Alexandre and see what he might say about those conditions, because they are so much lower than what we see in the Ottawa River watershed overall. And that is the one thing that sort of comes to mind, given the number of small dams that are present. Lake Ontario has a couple of dams, but it is a system that flows quite easily.
The connection cut a bit. Are we answering the question about anoxic condition in the watershed. Yeah, Howard's question, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. You've already addressed the eutrophication aspect of the river. So we need to find conditions that we know produce anoxia, and exactly it is the flooding of terrestrial ecosystem will, invariably lead to anoxia, and therefore a prime site for methylmercury production. That's a very straightforward process. Yes.
Okay, another question from Carol asking whether high levels of algal growth are an indicator of mercury. I'll toss that over to Alexandre because I know you.
I would say, so I don't know if Carol is concerned that if she sees a lot of algal growth, it might be linked to toxic effect of mercury or potentially increased risk. The answer is no. The increased algal growth will be related to the water chemistry that supports the growth of algae, such as nutrients, light, temperature. And it will have consequences on how mercury enters food web, for sure. But the presence of those of the growth of algae is, a sign that the water quality in the water body you're interested in has changed. Probably that nutrient concentration have increased, but not necessarily related to mercury.
And I think another point around that is the fact that what you said first early on is looking at water, like what is present in the water column itself is not necessarily a good indicator of mercury, because it is really when it transforms into methylmercury and when it bioaccumulates and magnifies within the organisms that live around or in the water. So, looking at the fish species is one of the ways to understand the impact of mercury, because if you do a grab sample of the water, you're not necessarily going to catch what is actually happening in that section of a river or a lake.
All right, we're approaching the end of the webinar, so I'll just shoot this one quickly to Larissa. William asked whether the mercury analysis is broken down into sub-watersheds. Is that something we did in the analysis?
No, it's not. Oh, would that be amazing? It's not, but we did do like a lot of different sections of it. So different fish species, different trends. In the report itself, there's like a whole number of charts at the end. So if you know where your subwatershed is located, you can take a look at those results for the section. And then there are some maps at the very, very end that show some of the levels based on fish species and the presence of dams. And so you can get a bit more information by looking at the report itself, but we didn't do a specific analysis on the subwatersheds, mostly because there's just so many of them. And so looking at our capacity, this is how it made it a little bit easier to be able to do the analysis in a way that shared the information broadly.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thanks, Larissa, and thank you, Alexandre, for coming and speaking to everyone. Really appreciate everyone tuning in, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.